The shuttle landed on the gray surface of Arcturus moon with a soft thud, and Alara Vance stepped out into the cold artificial air with nothing but a single bag hanging from her shoulder. She was small for a human, and her dark hair was cut short in a way that suggested she did not care much about appearances, and her eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they moved constantly across the landing platform, taking in every detail, every shadow, every possible threat, but nobody noticed this to the other students waiting at the platform. She was just another human transfer, and humans were still considered the newcomers of the galaxy, and most species did not pay them much attention. A tall Valorian with crystal horns that caught the light glanced at her and then looked away with disinterest, and a group of massive four-armed Crethani walked past her without even registering her presence, and a small bioluminescent Sylphie, whose skin glowed with soft blue light, tried to catch her eye and smile, but Alara simply walked past with her gaze fixed on the ground. This was exactly how she wanted it. The Arcturus Interstellar Academy spread across the terraformed moon like a small city, and it was home to the children of diplomats and military leaders and corporate executives from 37 different species, and it was considered one of the finest educational institutions in the known galaxy. And it was also the place where 3 students had gone missing in the past 2 months. Nobody knew what had happened to them. The official report said they had wandered into dangerous areas of the moon where the local predators still roamed, and that their disappearances were tragic accidents and nothing more. But Alara knew better. She had read the sealed files before accepting this assignment, and she had seen the patterns that the Academy security forces had missed, and she understood what was hunting in the shadows of this place. The thing that was killing students was not an animal. It was something far older and far more dangerous, and it had been feeding on intelligent species since before most civilizations in the galaxy had learned to use fire. The Galactic Hunters Guild called them hollows. They were creatures that existed partially outside of normal space, and they could move through walls and become invisible, and they fed on the minds of sapient beings, and they left nothing behind but fear and empty silence. Alara had killed 14 of them in her career. She was very good at killing things that should not exist. But here at the Academy, she was just a quiet transfer student who sat in the back of every classroom and ate alone in the corner of the dining hall and spoke to no one unless absolutely necessary. Her room assignment placed her with a Sylphie named Meryl, whose skin flickered with light whenever she felt strong emotions, and Meryl was friendly and curious, and she tried very hard to get Alara to open up. "So where are you from?" Meryl asked on their first night together as she arranged glowing plants on her side of the room. "I have never met a human before, and I have so many questions." Alara unpacked her bag slowly, and her movements were precise and economical, and she did not look up. She answered, "Earth originally, and then a few colony worlds, and nothing interesting." "What are you studying?" "Xenobiology." "Oh, that is wonderful, and I'm studying xenobiology too, and maybe we can be study partners." Alara finally looked up, and her gray eyes met Meryl's glowing ones, and for just a moment something flickered in those human eyes, something cold and ancient, and then it was gone. "Maybe," she said, and then she turned away and climbed into her bed and faced the wall. Meryl's glow dimmed with disappointment, but she did not give up, and over the next 3 weeks she tried everything she could think of to befriend her strange human roommate. She invited Alara to parties and study groups and social gatherings of every kind, and Alara declined them all with the same flat politeness, and eventually Meryl started to believe what everyone else on campus believed. Human girl was broken. Some species simply could not adapt to life among so many different kinds of beings, and humans were still new to the galactic community, and perhaps this one had simply shut down under the pressure. "She never talks to anyone," Meryl confided to her friends one evening as they gathered in the common area, "and she never smiles, and she never seems interested in anything at all, and I think there is something wrong with her." The Valorian student named Thessaly nodded her crystal horns, chiming softly as she moved. Humans are strange creatures, and they have only been part of galactic society for a few generations, and perhaps they are not as adaptable as we thought. A massive Krethani named Korvax rumbled in agreement. I do not understand why the Academy even accepts them, and they contribute nothing, and they have no special abilities, and they are small and weak and unremarkable in every way. None of them noticed that Alara was walking past at that moment, and none of them noticed the small smile that flickered across her face as she heard their words. Being underestimated was the greatest advantage a hunter could have. That night, Alara waited until Miral's glow had faded into the soft pulse of sleep, and then she slipped out of bed without making a sound, and she dressed in clothing that seemed to absorb the light around it, and she retrieved items from a hidden compartment in her bag that would have shocked anyone who saw a Thema blade made of metal that shifted and flickered like it could not decide which dimension it belonged to. A pistol loaded with ammunition that glowed with a faint sickly green light, a mask that would filter out the psychic emanations of her prey. She was not Alara Vance. That identity had been created 6 months ago by the best forgers in the Terran Confederation, and it would not survive any serious investigation. But serious investigations required someone to be suspicious first, and nobody was suspicious of the quiet, broken human girl. Her real name was classified at the highest levels of human government, but the creatures she hunted knew her by another name. They called her the Silence, and tonight, the Silence was going hunting. She slipped out of the dormitory window and dropped 3 stories to the ground below landing without a sound, and then she disappeared into the shadows of the campus, moving toward the place where she knew the Hollow would be waiting somewhere. Out there, something ancient and hungry was searching for its next meal. It did not know that the meal had decided to hunt back. The campus of Arcturus Academy was beautiful at night, with its carefully designed gardens and glowing pathways and buildings that rose toward the artificial sky like monuments to cooperation between species. But Alara did not see the beauty. She saw the shadows between the lights and the blind spots in the security coverage, and the places where something could hide and wait for prey to wander too close. She moved through the darkness like she was part of it, and her stealth suit absorbed light and sound and heat, and to any observer she would have been invisible, and even the most advanced sensors would have registered nothing but empty air. The Hollow was near the library. She could feel it. After years of hunting these creatures, she had developed a sense for their presence, and it was like a cold pressure at the edge of her mind and a wrongness in the air that made her skin want to crawl away from her bones. Most beings who felt this sensation ran. Alara walked toward it. The library was a massive structure built in the Valorian style with crystal walls that caught and reflected the starlight. And during the day it was filled with students from dozens of species, studying and arguing and learning together. Now it was empty and dark, and the crystal walls seemed to pulse with a light that came from nowhere. Alara stopped in the courtyard before the main entrance, and she stood perfectly still, and she waited. The Hollow emerged from between moments. That was the only way to describe how these creatures moved, and 1 second there was nothing, and the next second there was a shimmer in the air, like heat rising from hot metal, and then the shimmer became a shape. It was beautiful in a terrible way. The Hollow had too many limbs, and they bent at angles that should not have been possible, and its body was made of something that was not quite matter and not quite light, and its face, if it could be called a face, was a smooth surface with no features except for a mouth that opened too wide and contained nothing but darkness. It saw Alara. It was confused. This was not how prey was supposed to behave, and prey was supposed to run and scream and fill the air with delicious fear, and this small human just stood there, looking at it with eyes that held no terror at all. The Hollow reached out with its mind, and it pushed against Alara's consciousness, and it tried to fill her with the primal horror that had shattered the sanity of 1,000 species across 1,000,000 years. Alara felt the pressure, and she smiled. "Is that all you have?" she said quietly. Then she attacked the blade in her hand, sang through the air, and it cut through dimensions as easily as it cut through flesh, and the hollow screamed in a frequency that would give nearby students nightmares for weeks as it tried to phase away from this impossible threat. But Elara was faster. She had trained for this her entire adult life, and she had studied the movements of hollows until she could predict them, and she had modified her body with enhancements that were illegal in most systems, and she had become something that evolution had never intended human design to kill nightmares. The fight lasted 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, Elara moved with a speed and precision that would have stunned any observer, and she struck 17 times, and each strike was calculated to damage and weaken and anchor the creature to normal space. And by the time 11 seconds had passed, the hollow was dying. It collapsed onto the courtyard stones, and its body began to dissolve, and it looked up at the small human standing over it, and there was something in its alien mind that might have been surprise. How could this be? How could something so small and so young and so seemingly weak destroy a being that had hunted intelligent life since before stars had Namisalara knelt beside the dying creature, and she watched it fade with clinical detachment. "Your kind made a mistake," she said softly. "You hunted us when we were young, and you taught us to fear the dark, and you thought that fear would make us prey forever." The hollow shuddered, and more of its form dissolved into nothing. "But we learned," Elara continued, "we learned that fear can be a weapon, and we learned that the dark can be a home, and we learned that the things which hunt can also be hunted." The last of the hollow faded away, and there was nothing left but a faint scorch mark on the stones and a silence that seemed deeper than before. Elara stood, and she cleaned her blade with practiced movements, and she checked her ammunition, and she scanned the area for any sign of another threat. There was none. One hollow was dead, and that meant the immediate danger was over, but she knew from experience that these creatures rarely hunted alone, and somewhere on this moon there was probably at least one more waiting and watching and trying to understand what had killed its companion. She would deal with that when the time came. For now, she needed to return to her dormitory before anyone noticed she was gone. She moved back through the campus as silently as she had come, and she climbed the wall to her window, and she slipped back into her room, and she hid her weapons, and she changed into sleeping clothes. Muriel was still asleep, and her glow had not changed, and she had no idea that her roommate had just killed something that had eaten civilization. Sela lay down in her bed as she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about the creature she had just destroyed, and she felt nothing. No satisfaction, and no guilt, and no excitement, and nothing at all. This was her job, and this was what she had been made for, and this was what humanity had decided to become. When they realized that the universe was darker and more dangerous than anyone had imagined, other species looked at humans and saw small, fragile creatures with no natural weapons and no special abilities, and nothing that made them stand out from the hundreds of other middling species in the galaxy. They did not see what humans had become in the shadows. They did not see the hunters, and that was exactly how it was supposed to be. Elara closed her eyes, and she slept without dreams, and in the morning she would go to class and sit in the back and say nothing and be invisible. The quiet, broken human girl who did not adapt. Most merciless hunter the galaxy had ever known. The disappearances stopped, and the academy celebrated, and security forces claimed victory, and life returned to normal for most students, but not for every Kovacs. The massive Krethani had been close friends with the first student who vanished, and he had spent weeks searching for answers, while everyone else accepted the official explanation of wild animal attacks, and he had found something strange. The security footage from the night the disappearances ended showed something impossible. It was corrupted and blurry and barely visible, but there was a shape moving across the campus at 3 in the morning, and that shape moved faster than any known species could move, and it seemed to flow through shadows like it was made of darkness. Himself, Korvax studied that footage for hours, and he enhanced it and analyzed it, and compared it to the movement patterns of every species registered at the Academy. Nothing matched except one thing: the general body shape was humanoid, and the proportions suggested something small and compact, and when he slowed the footage to its lowest possible speed, he caught a glimpse of something that might have been dark hair. He brought his findings to Thessaly the Valorian, whose sister had been the second victim, and she had been consumed by grief and anger since the disappearance, and she wanted answers more than anyone. "You think a human did this?" she asked, her crystal horns flickering with doubt. "I think a human was there," Korvax replied. "And I think whoever this was stopped the attack somehow, and I want to know how." They began to watch the human students. There were only 12 humans at the Academy, and most of them were easy to eliminate as suspects, and they were too social or too visible, or too obviously ordinary. But one human stood out: Elara. Vance sat alone in the back of their xenobiology lecture, and she never spoke, unless directly asked a question, and she completed assignments with bare minimum effort, and she moved through the campus like a ghost that wanted to be forgotten. "She is strange," Thessaly admitted. "But strange does not mean dangerous, and she seems more broken than threatening." "Watch her movements," Korvax said. "Watch how she walks." Thessaly watched, and slowly she began to see what the Kreth Ani had noticed. Elara moved with a fluid economy that did not match her appearance, and every step was perfectly balanced, and every motion was efficient and controlled. And she walked like someone who was always aware of everything around her. "She moves like a predator," Thessaly whispered. They began to follow her. It was difficult because Elara seemed to sense when she was being observed, and she would change her patterns and take different routes, and somehow always managed to be exactly where they were not looking. But they were patient, and over the following weeks they gathered more evidence. Elara never startled at unexpected sounds, because she always seemed to hear things before anyone else, and her eyes tracked movement at the edges of rooms with an intensity that seemed wrong for a student who supposedly cared about nothing. And she ate alone, not because she was sad, but because she was watching everyone else. Then came the day that changed everything. A construction drone malfunctioned during a routine repair, and a massive steel beam broke free from its clamps, and it fell toward a group of students who were walking below, completely unaware of the danger above them. Thessaly was watching from across the courtyard, and she saw what happened next. Elara moved, not ran, and not jumped, and not dodged. She moved in a way that Thessaly's crystalline eyes could barely track, and those eyes had evolved to follow objects moving through the vacuum of space at incredible speeds. And yet this human girl almost blurred. One moment Elara was sitting on a bench 20 meters away, and the next moment she was under the falling beam, and she caught it. She caught a steel beam that weighed more than she did, and she held it for just long enough for the students below to scatter in panic, and then she set it down gently, and she walked away. Nobody else seemed to notice what had actually happened, and they were too busy running and screaming, and the chaos hid the truth. But Thessaly saw, and Korvax, who had been watching from another angle, saw too. They met in an empty classroom that night, and they compared what they had witnessed, and they tried to make sense of it. "That is not possible," Korvax said. "Humans are not strong enough to catch something like that, and they are not fast enough to move like that, and nothing about what I saw makes any sense." "And yet we both saw it," Thessaly replied. "We both saw the same thing, and that means it happened." "What is she?" "I do not know, but I am going to find out." They increased their surveillance, and they took more risks, and they got closer and closer to the truth that Elara was hiding. And Elara noticed she had known she was being watched since the third day of their observation, and she had considered eliminating the threat, but these were just curious students, not enemies, and killing them would create more problems than it solved. So she let them watch. She let them gather their evidence and draw their conclusions, and she waited to see what they would do with the information. Part of her was impressed by their persistence, and most beings would have given up by now and would have convinced themselves that they had imagined what they saw. These two kept looking, they kept asking questions, they refused to accept comfortable Leeson. Some ways they reminded her of herself, when she was young, and before the guild had found her, and before she had learned what really lurked in the shadows of the universe. She wondered if they were ready for the truth. She wondered if anyone ever really was the second. Hollow made its presence known 3 weeks after she killed the first one, and she felt it probing the edges of the campus, testing the defenses, looking for weakness. It was bigger than the first and older and smarter. It had felt its companion die, and now it was hunting the hunter. Alara smiled in the darkness of her room as Meryl slept beside her. The hunt was about to begin again. This time she might need to reveal more than she wanted. The atmospheric gardens were beautiful at night, with plants from 100 different worlds glowing and pulsing with bioluminescent light, and the air was thick with alien perfumes and the sound of artificial streams flowing through carefully designed channels. Alara sat on a meditation stone in the center of the largest garden, and she waited. The second Hollow was coming. She had spent 3 nights tracking its movements and learning its patterns and understanding how it thought, and now she knew exactly where it would appear, and exactly when. This one was different from the first. It was ancient in a way that made the first Hollow seemed like a child, and it had survived for thousands of years by being careful and patient and smart. And it had felt its companion die, and it wanted revenge, but more than revenge, it wanted to understand what had killed something that had never been killed before, and what kind of creature could destroy a Hollow, and how could such a thing exist? Without the Hollow knowing about it, it was coming to find answers. Alara intended to give it answers. The Hollow emerged from between dimensions slowly and carefully, and it materialized at the edge of the garden, like a nightmare taking shape, and it was massive and terrible and beautiful in the way that hurricanes are beautiful. It had more limbs than the first one, and they moved in patterns that hurt to watch, and its body was darker and more solid, and its presence pressed against reality, like a weight that wanted to crush everything beneath it. The psychic pressure rolled toward Alara like a wave. It was stronger than anything she had felt before, and it carried images of death and madness and eternal suffering, and it was designed to break minds before the physical attack even began. Alara felt it wash over her. She stood up from the meditation stone, and she drew her blade, and she smiled. "You are older than the last one," she said. "Good. And I was hoping for a challenge." The Hollow paused. This was wrong, and this small creature should be screaming and crawling and begging for mercy. And instead, it was standing there, with a weapon that should not exist, and it was smiling. What was this thing the Hollow reached deeper into Alara's mind, and it searched for the fear that all living things possessed, and it found nothing but cold calculation and patient violence and memories of 100 creatures, just like itself, dying at this human's hands. Hollow felt something it had not felt in millennia. It felt uncertain. Alara attacked. The fight was longer than the first one, and it was harder and more brutal, and that Hollow was smart enough to adapt, and it learned from every strike, and it changed its tactics constantly. But Alara had been training for this her entire life. She had studied Hollows from the moment the guild recruited her when she was 16 years old, and she had memorized every recorded encounter and every fragment of information, and she had fought and killed 14 of these creatures before this one. She knew how they moved and how they thought and how they died. Hollow struck at her with limbs that could pass through solid matter, and Alara twisted away from attacks that should have been unavoidable, and she countered with strikes that burned and anchored, and weakened blood flowed from wounds on her arms and legs and torso as the creature landed glancing blows, and a normal human would have collapsed from the pain long ago. But Alara was not a normal human. She had been modified and enhanced and rebuilt into something that could survive things that would kill ordinary people. and she had trained her mind to ignore pain and to focus only on the objective. The objective was simple: kill the monster. The fight lasted 47 seconds, and in those seconds, Alara took more damage than she had taken in years, and when it was over, she was bleeding from a dozen wounds, and her left arm was hanging wrong, and her vision was blurry from blood loss. But the hollow was dying. It lay on the ground of the garden, and its form was dissolving, and it looked up at the humans standing over it with something that might have been awe. "Why are you?" it asked, and its voice was like static and broken glass. Alara knelt beside it, and she watched it fade with the same clinical detachment she always felt. "I am human," she said. "We are what the universe made when it needed something to fight back against the darkness." The hollow shuddered, and more of its body dissolved. "There are more of us," it whispered. "Thousands more hiding in the spaces between stars, and you cannot kill them all. We have killed most of you already." Alara replied, "Your kind numbered in the millions. Once and now there are only thousands, and in another century there will be only hundreds, and then dozens, and then none." The hollow made a sound that might have been laughter. "You are more terrible than we ever were." "Yes," Alara said simply, "we are." The last of the hollow faded away, and the garden was silent, except for the sound of artificial streams and glowing plants. Alara stood slowly, and pain shot through her body, but she ignored it as she began to treat her wounds with supplies from her belt. She did not notice Korvax and Thessaly watching from the upper terrace of the garden until she turned to leave. They had followed her tonight, and they had seen everything. For a long moment, all three of them were frozen in place. Thessaly's glow flickered wildly with shock and fear and fascination, and Korvax's forearms hung limp at his sides, and his massive body seemed small. Somehow Alara looked at them, and she calculated the options. She could kill them and hide the bodies, and no one would ever know. But these were students, not enemies, and they had done nothing wrong, and they had only wanted answers to the disappearances that had taken people they cared about. She sighed, and it was a very human sound, full of resignation and tiredness. "I suppose we should talk," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse and pain, and it was the most she had spoken to anyone since arriving at the academy. Thessaly found her voice first. "What was that thing? And what are you? And how is any of this possible?" "Those are good questions," Alara replied. "I will answer them, but first I need to treat these wounds before I'd pass out from blood loss." She walked toward them, and they flinched back, but she only sat down on a nearby bench, and she continued bandaging her injuries. "You wanted the truth," she said without looking up. "Now you are going to get it, and I warn you that you will wish you had never asked." Korvax and Thessaly looked at each other, and they made a silent decision. They sat down across from the wounded human girl, and they waited to hear what secrets the quiet transfer student had been hiding. They met in an abandoned maintenance tunnel beneath the campus, where the air was cold and the lights flickered, and no one would interrupt them. Alara arrived first, and she scanned every corner for surveillance devices, and she found none, and then she waited in the darkness until Korvax and Thessaly arrived together. They looked nervous and uncertain, and their body language said they were not sure if they were meeting a protector or a predator. I understood that confusion in many ways. She was both. "You killed those things," Thessaly said, and her crystal horns caught the dim light as she spoke. "The creatures that took my sister and the others." "Yes." "What were they?" Alara leaned against the tunnel wall, and her wounds were healing already, thanks to the military-grade medication flowing through her blood, but she was still tired and still sore and still very far from recovered. "They are called hollows," she said. "They are extra-dimensional predators that have been feeding on intelligent species since before your ancestors developed language, and they exist partially outside of normal space, which makes them invisible to most sensors and nearly impossible to kill." "Nearly impossible," Korvax repeated. "Nearly and not completely, and My people have been hunting them for a very long time. Thessaly's glow flickered with confusion. Your people, and you mean humans, but humans are new to the galactic community, and you have only been traveling between stars for a few generations. Alara smiled, and it was a tired smile without any warmth. That is what we want other species to believe. She explained then in slow, careful words the truth that humanity had kept hidden since first contact. Humans had not discovered that the universe was dangerous when they left their home planet, and they had known for thousands of years before then. And they had known because things like the Hollows had come to Earth long ago, and the ancient darkness of prehistory creatures from between the stars had found the small blue world, and they had hunted the primitive beings that lived there, and they had fed on fear and pain and death. Most species that encountered such horrors died or went mad or developed elaborate beliefs to pretend the horrors did not exist. Humans had done something different. They had fought back. They had organized and studied and experimented, and they had found ways to hurt things that should not have been able to be hurt, and they had trained themselves to face nightmares without breaking, and they had become something new. The first hunters were shamans and warriors who learned to see between worlds, and they passed their knowledge down through generations and over centuries. The scattered groups became networks, and the networks became organizations, and the organizations eventually became the Guild of Galactic Hunters. Guild was older than most human civilizations, and it had been protecting Earth from things that came from the dark since before writing was invented. When humanity finally reached the stars, they found that the universe was full of the same horrors. They had been fighting at home, and they also found that most other species had no idea these horrors existed. The Guild made a decision. They would protect everyone, but they would do it in secret, because the things they hunted fed on fear and knowledge and attention, and the more species that knew about hollows and rift spawn and the dreaming plague and all the other threats, the stronger those threats became. So humanity played the role of the quiet newcomers and the unremarkable species with no special abilities, and the small fragile beings who contributed nothing special to galactic civilization, and in the shadows the hunters worked. How many of you are there? Korvax asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. Thousands, Alara replied, spread across every system where humans live, and many systems where they do not, and we take contracts, and we eliminate threats, and we keep the comfortable lies alive. Why are you telling us this? Thessaly demanded. You could have killed us, and no one would have known. I could have, and I considered it. Both students tensed, and Alara continued without changing her tone. But you are not enemies, and you only wanted answers about what happened to your people, and I decided you deserved the truth. She pushed away from the wall, and she winced as the movement pulled at her healing wounds. The hollows that were hunting here are dead, and your academy is safe now, and in 3 months my contract ends, and I will transfer somewhere else, and you will never see me again. And we are supposed to just forget what we saw. Korvax asked. You can tell anyone you want, and no one will believe you, and there is no evidence and no proof, and the official story about wild animal attacks is much more comfortable than the truth. She walked toward the tunnel exit, and she paused, and she looked back at them. Or you can keep this secret, and understand that somewhere out there humans are always watching and always hunting and always keeping the darkness at bay. Thessaly's glow was steady now, and the fear had faded and something else had taken its place. Why do you do it? She asked. The hiding and the pretending and letting everyone think you are weak and unremarkable. And why not tell the galaxy what you really are? Alara considered the question for a long moment. Because someone has to hold the line. She said finally, someone has to face the things that come from the dark, and someone has to keep fighting even when there is no recognition and no reward and no end in sight. She smiled, and for the first time since they had met, it seemed like a real smile. And humans are very good at being overlooked until it is far too late. She walked out of the tunnel, and she disappeared into the artificial moonlight of the campus Korvax. And Thessaly sat in silence for a long time after she left. I never want to be enemies with humans, Korvax said eventually. Thessaly nodded, her crystal horns chiming softly. I do not think anyone in the galaxy would want that, and not if they knew the truth. The next day in the commissary, Alara sat in her usual corner alone as always, but this time someone approached her. It was Meryl, her bioluminescent roommate, with a lunch tray in her hands and a nervous flicker in her glow. Mind if I sit? Alara looked up, and for a moment she was the hunter again, cold and calculating, and ready for anything. Then she was just a tired young woman who had been alone for a very long time. Sure, she said. I would like that. Meryl sat down, and her glow brightened with happiness, and she started talking about classes and gossip and all the normal things that normal students talked about. Alara listened, and she ate her food, and she even answered questions sometimes. Across the room, Korvax and Thessaly watched, and they smiled. The quiet human girl was still the most dangerous thing on the moon, but she was also still human, and even the most merciless hunter needed something to protect besides the mission. Even the silence needed someone to hear. In the darkness between stars, the things that hunted sentient life continued their endless search for prey, and in the light of a million worlds, humans walked among other species, small and quiet and unremarkable, waiting, watching, ready, because the darkness was vast and endless and hungry. Humanity had decided long ago that they would be the thing the darkness feared, the end.